All right, welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're tackling something that, always seems to get people fired up, immigration enforcement in America.
Oh, yeah, it's a hot button issue for sure.
Yeah. And, our listeners actually getting ready for a meeting where it's likely to come up. They want to be able to, talk about it intelligently, but without, like, getting bogged down in all the partisan stuff.
Yeah, I get that. It's
Right.
easy to get lost in the rhetoric.
Exactly. So we've pulled together some testimonies from a recent congressional hearing on this. We've got perspectives from, all over the map, really. The Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, Immigration Accountability Project, Center for Immigration Studies.
Wow, that's a pretty diverse range of viewpoints.
It is. And, what we're going to try to do is sort of untangle all the threads and give our listener the tools to, like, form their own opinions, not just tell them what to think.
Sounds like a plan. Where do we start?
Well, I thought we could start by looking at how two different administrations, Trump and Biden, approached immigration enforcement. Kind of a tale of two approaches.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. Those two administrations really represent two very different philosophies when it comes to immigration.
Absolutely. So the Cato Institute, through David Beer's testimony, argues that the Trump administration basically, like, deliberately made it harder for people to immigrate legally.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, like, Beer points to the fact that immigration forms got way longer under Trump, like hundreds of pages longer, made the whole process way more intimidating.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's definitely a barrier for a lot of people.
Right. And he also talks about things like the travel bans and the restrictions based on, how much money someone makes. Beer's argument is basically that the Trump administration was trying to limit legal immigration, through all these policies.
Hmm. So it was more than just rhetoric, according to Beer.
Right. And he actually has data to back it up. He shows that under Trump, legal immigration actually dropped significantly. But here's where it gets really interesting. Beer also says that even though Trump was always talking about border security, his administration actually, like, weakened enforcement in some ways.
Oh, now that's a twist. I'm curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
But Beer points to things like a drop in prosecutions for illegal entry and the fact that agents were often reassigned away from criminal investigations.
So he's saying that the focus shifted away from actual enforcement.
Exactly. And his argument hinges on this idea of prosecutorial discretion. Basically, immigration agencies only have so many resources, right? So they have to prioritize. And Beer suggesting that under Trump, those priorities were kind of messed up. They
Yeah.
focus more on, like, trying to deter people rather than on actual effective enforcement.
I see. So instead of going after criminals, they were more focused on just keeping people out.
Yeah, that's Beer's take, anyway. But then on the flip side, we have John Fabrator from the Heritage Foundation, and he has a completely different view of this whole period.
Oh, I bet. What does he say?
He argues that it was actually the Biden administration that led to a reckless abandonment of immigration enforcement. He says that Biden's policies basically put American communities at risk.
Wow. So you've got one side saying Trump sabotaged the system and the other saying Biden abandoned it. Talk about two different perspectives.
I know, right? It's wild. It really shows how the same period can be seen in such different ways. Like, it makes you realize how important it is to really look at who's saying what and why.
For sure. Bias and agendas play a huge role in shaping these narratives.
Absolutely. You can't just take anything at face value, You got to dig a little deeper. Okay, so let's dive into a term that gets thrown around a lot in these debates, catch and release.
Yeah, you hear that one all the time.
Grant Newman from the Immigration Accountability Project, he defines it as, when people are caught crossing the border illegally, but then they're just, like, released into the U.S., often with just a notice to appear in court, at some point later on.
Right, which, as you can imagine, doesn't always happen.
Exactly. And Newman argues that the Biden administration basically embraced this practice big time. He says that millions of people who didn't even, like, meet the requirements to enter the country were just let go.
It's a pretty bold claim.
It is, and he contrasts this with the Trump administration, which he says took a way stricter approach. He's really big on limiting, the government's power to just decide who gets to stay and who doesn't. He thinks the only option should be, like, detention, sending them back to their home country, or, officially removing them.
So basically, less wiggle room, less discretion.
Yeah, exactly. Make the consequences, more clear cut. And he specifically calls for bringing back the Remain in Mexico policy. That was, a Trump thing where asylum seekers had to wait in Mexico while their cases were being
Oh,
processed.
yeah, that was a pretty controversial
Uh,
policy. And Biden got rid of it.
he did. And it's still, like, a major point of contention. Some people think it was cruel and inhumane, while others say it was necessary to control the border.
It definitely highlights the different philosophies at play, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So you've got Newman pushing for stricter enforcement, making things tougher. But then you've got Beer saying, no, the problem is that the legal immigration system is just too broken, too hard to navigate. We need to fix that, not make things even harder.
Two very different diagnoses, leading to two very different prescriptions.
Exactly. It's like, is the patient sick because of a virus or because they're not eating right?
Great analogy.
And that, I think, is kind of the theme that runs through all these testimonies. Are we dealing with a system that's fundamentally flawed? Or is it just a matter of, like, enforcing the rules we already have?
Big questions. All right, so where do we go from here?
Well, now, I thought we could talk about another hot-button issue, sanctuary cities.
Ah, yes, always a topic that sparks debate.
It really does. So sanctuary cities, they're basically places where local law enforcement doesn't cooperate with federal immigration authorities, like ICE.
Right, so they're kind of like safe havens for people who are, in the country illegally.
That's the idea, yeah. And both Joan Fabricator and Jessica Vaughn, she's from the Center for Immigration Studies, they argue that these policies basically create these safe havens for, anyone, even if they've committed crimes.
So their concern is that these sanctuary cities are shielding criminals from being deported.
Exactly. They say it undermines the rule of law and puts communities at risk.
I can see how that would be a concern. But what about the argument that sanctuary cities are necessary to protect immigrant communities from, overzealous enforcement?
That's definitely the other side of the coin. And it's a tough balance, right? You want to protect people who are vulnerable, but you also don't want to create a situation where criminals are, like, roaming free.
Right, it's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Yeah. Fabricator, he uses a pretty powerful example to illustrate his point. He talks about a case in Denver where the sheriff's department released a guy even though he had a previous homicide conviction.
Oh, wow, that's serious.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff. And according to Fabricator, this guy went on to commit another crime after he was released. So his argument is, like, if local law enforcement had cooperated with ICE, this tragedy could have been prevented.
That's a compelling argument, for
Right.
sure. Makes you think about the potential consequences of those sanctuary policies.
It does, and it raises a question for our listener to consider. Are there times when limiting cooperation with ICE actually puts public safety at risk?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's like, where do you draw the line?
Exactly. Vaughn, she also argues that a lot of these sanctuary policies are based on, like, misconceptions about ICE and that they're driven by, political agendas rather than a genuine concern for public safety.
So she's saying that it's more about politics than about protecting people.
That's her take, yeah. She brings up a lot of cases where people with serious criminal records were released because of these policies. She's basically saying that they end up doing more harm than good.
I see. So again, we've got these two very different perspectives. One side saying sanctuary cities protect communities, the other side saying they endanger them. It's hard to know what to believe sometimes.
It is, but, that's why it's so important to look at all sides of the issue and, like, try to form your own opinion. Don't just blindly accept what someone tells you.
Absolutely. Critical thinking is key.
So while Fabricator and Vaughn are, like, really focused on the risks of sanctuary cities, there's another perspective we should consider. David Beer from the Cato Institute, he actually argues that immigrants are statistically less likely to commit serious crimes than people born in the U.S.
Oh, interesting. So he's pushing back against that whole narrative that immigrants are dangerous.
Yeah, exactly. He's saying, hey, let's look at the data, not just our assumptions.
I like that. Data over dogma.
Right. It's like you got to have evidence to back up your claims. Okay, so now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the concerns that have been raised about, like, potential abuse within the immigration system itself, specifically programs like humanitarian parole, temporary protected status, and visa overstays.
Oh, yeah, those are definitely areas where things can get a bit murky.
Yeah, they can. So Grant Newman, he argues that humanitarian parole, which is supposed to be for, like, really exceptional cases, has been totally misused. He says it's being used to let in tons of people who wouldn't normally qualify for entry.
So like a loophole.
Yeah, kind of. Like, it's meant for emergency situations, but he says it's become this way to, like, bypass the normal rules.
So he wants stricter oversight, basically.
Exactly. More vetting, making sure that it's only used for the situations it was intended for.
Makes sense.
Then there's temporary protected status, or TPS. This is for people from countries that are experiencing like wars or natural disasters. It lets them stay in the U.S. until things get better back home.
Right, I've heard of that. It's meant to be a temporary safe haven.
It is. But both Newman and Vaughn argue that for a lot of people, TPS has basically become permanent. Like some countries have had that designation for decades.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
So it's become more of a backdoor to permanent residency.
Kind of, yeah. And they say that, it wasn't supposed to be that way. It undermines the whole purpose of the program.
I see their point. It creates this weird limbo where people are, like, technically temporary, but also living their lives here indefinitely.
Exactly. And then finally, there's visa overstays. This is where people come to the U.S. on a visa, but then they just, never leave.
Oh, yeah. That's a big one. I've heard it's a huge problem.
It is. Vaughn says it's a major issue, and she blames, weak enforcement and a lack of consequences for people who overstay. She basically says that the system makes it too easy to just disappear.
So both Newman and Vaughn seem to be saying that these programs, even though they were designed with good intentions, are now being exploited, and we need to tighten things up.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. They're calling for stricter eligibility requirements, better vetting and getting rid of policies that basically give people work permits and protection from deportation just for applying.
So a more rigorous and accountable system, basically.
Exactly. And again, it all goes back to that question of intent versus consequences, Are these programs actually achieving what they were supposed to achieve, or are there all these unintended consequences that are, messing things up?
Food for thought. It makes you wonder if we need to, rethink these programs from the ground up.
Maybe so. Okay, now John Fabricator, he also spends a lot of time talking about the role of criminal organizations in all of this, specifically gangs like Tren Aragua and, the Mexican drug cartels.
Yeah, those are some serious players.
They are. And his argument is that these groups, they thrive in environments where there's weak cooperation between local and federal law enforcement.
Makes sense. The less coordination, the easier it is for them to operate under the radar.
Right. And Fabricator's testimony is really interesting because he's speaking from experience, He used to be an ICE officer, so he's seen this stuff firsthand.
Oh, wow. So he's got the inside scoop.
He does. And he tells this really chilling story about a woman in Colorado who was, terrorized by members of Tren Aragua right in her own apartment complex.
Oh, my gosh. That's scary.
Yeah, it is. He actually ended up helping her relocate because she was so scared for her safety.
Wow. So it shows the very real human impact of these criminal organizations. It's not just some abstract concept. It's affecting people's lives.
Exactly. And Fabricator connects this back to the sanctuary city debate, right? He says that by, hindering cooperation with ICE, these policies are basically creating safe havens for these criminal groups to operate.
I see. So in his view, sanctuary cities are actually making the problem worse.
That's his argument. He also talks a lot about the impact of the cartels, especially their role in the whole fentanyl crisis. He says that weak border enforcement makes it way easier for them to smuggle drugs into the country. And that's fueling, addiction, overdoses, all that.
So he's saying it's not just about immigration, it's about national security and public health.
Right. He sees it as a direct link between, lax enforcement and the power of these really dangerous groups.
So what does he propose we do about it?
Well, he's a big advocate for stronger border security, more enforcement inside the country, and cracking down on the people who are involved in, the criminal activities related to immigration.
Makes sense. Hit them where it hurts, disrupt their operations.
Exactly. So we've got all these complex issues on the table, right? But what about solutions? What are people in Congress actually proposing to do about all this?
Yeah, it's easy to point fingers and criticize, but are there any concrete plans to address these challenges?
Well, the testimonies we've been looking at, they offer a bunch of different recommendations. But there does seem to be, a general consensus that something needs to be done. The system isn't working as it is.
So there's agreement on the problem, but maybe not on the solution.
Yeah, pretty much. There's broad support for, strengthening border security, doing more enforcement within the country, and just clarifying the laws around immigration, making them, more clear and consistent.
So basically reforming the system to make it more effective and maybe a little less chaotic.
Exactly. And some specific pieces of legislation are mentioned, like there's the Lake and Riley Act, which would give state attorneys general more power to enforce immigration laws.
Oh, interesting. So giving more authority to the states.
Yeah. And then there's HR2, the Secure the Border Act. That one's like a whole package of changes aimed at, overhauling the system.
So different approaches, but with the same goal in mind.
Right. And there are other recommendations, too. Like some people want to focus on cracking down on visa overstays or addressing fraud within immigration programs.
So closing loopholes, making sure the rules are actually being followed.
Exactly. It's like everyone agrees that the system needs some work. It's just a matter of figuring out how to fix it.
A lot of different tools in the toolbox.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
All right. So the last thing we're going to touch on is the impact of immigration on, the U.S. economy and American communities. And this is where we see a pretty clear divide between like the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation.
Ah, yes. The age-old debate. Does immigration help or hurt the country?
It's a big one. So David Beer from Cato, he's very much on the side of like immigrants are good for the economy.
Okay, what's his reasoning?
Well, he points to estimates from the Congressional Budget Office that say immigrants will contribute like trillions of dollars to the U.S. economy over the next decade.
Wow, that's a significant amount.
It is. And his argument is that, immigrants are filling jobs, starting businesses, paying taxes, they're contributing members of society. And he says that the current system, by making legal immigration so hard, is actually hurting the economy.
Interesting. So he's saying that making it easier for people to come here legally would actually benefit everyone.
Exactly. He thinks it would unlock all this economic potential. He also reminds us that statistically, immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than people born in the U.S.
Right, he brought that up earlier, challenging those negative stereotypes.
Yeah, exactly. So his whole perspective is very much like, hey, immigrants are an asset, not a threat.
Makes sense. But I'm guessing the Heritage Foundation has a different take.
Oh, yeah, they definitely do. John Fabricator, he's more concerned about the strain that, lax enforcement and sanctuary policies put on American communities.
Okay, so he's focusing more on the costs associated with immigration.
Right. He talks about, the burden on social services, healthcare, education. He argues that these costs outweigh the economic benefits.
So he's worried about the impact on taxpayers, essentially.
Yeah. And he also brings up things like, the rise in fentanyl deaths, human trafficking, violent crime. He links all of that to, people being in the country illegally.
I see. So he's painting a much bleaker picture.
He is. His focus is very much on, protecting American citizens and making sure their needs are met.
So two very different perspectives on the impact of immigration. One focused on the benefits, the other on the costs.
Exactly. And it's important to consider both, There's no easy answer here. It's complicated. So, wow, it seems like everyone has a different take on this whole immigration thing. It's kind of overwhelming, to be honest.
I know, right? We've gone through so much information, different perspectives, different arguments, different solutions.
It's a lot to unpack. As our listeners getting ready for their meeting, what are the key takeaways here?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that there's no simple answer, no easy fix. We've heard from people who want stricter enforcement, people who want to focus on reforming the legal immigration system, people who are worried about the economic impact, people who are concerned about security.
It's like everyone agrees that something needs to change, but no one can agree on what that change should be.
Exactly. And I think that's important for our listener to remember. Going into that meeting, knowing that there are valid points on all sides of this issue.
So, how do you even approach a conversation like that when everyone has such strong opinions?
Well, I think the key is to be respectful, to listen to what others have to say, and to be willing to consider different viewpoints.
Yeah, that makes sense. Don't just go in there trying to, win an argument.
Right. It's not about winning or losing. It's about understanding. And maybe, even finding some common ground.
Even though there's all this disagreement, there must be some things that people can agree on, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one thing that David Beer mentioned, even though he's critical of, enforcement-focused policies, is that everyone wants to reduce illegal immigration. That's a shared goal.
Yeah, that's true. No one wants to see people, risking their lives to cross the border or living in fear of being deported.
And that actually brings up an interesting question, something for our listener to think about as they delve further into this topic.
What is that?
Well, Beer kind of hinted at this, but what if the best way to reduce illegal immigration is actually to, reform the legal immigration system?
Oh, interesting. So instead of just trying to keep people out, we make it easier for them to come here legally.
Exactly. Make the process, less complicated, less expensive, less time-consuming, expand the pathways for legal immigration.
I never thought about it that way.
And maybe even address some of the root causes of migration, like poverty, violence, lack of opportunity in people's home countries. If we can help improve those conditions, maybe fewer people will feel the need to, uproot their lives and come here illegally.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like we're so focused on the symptoms, but we're not really addressing the underlying problem.
Right. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg.
Perfect analogy. Well, I think we've given our listener a lot to think about. This whole deep dive has been eye-opening, to say the least.
It really has. It's
Yeah.
made me realize just how complex this issue is, how many different factors are at play.
Yeah, it's not just black and white, There's a lot of gray area.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to keep that in mind as we continue to learn and engage in these conversations.
Like, we can't just shut down people who have different opinions. We have to be willing to, hear them out and try to understand where they're coming from.
Exactly. And remember that behind all the statistics and policy debates, there are real people, real families, real lives being impacted by these decisions.
Yeah, that's something we can't forget. This isn't just some abstract political issue. It's about real human beings.
It is. And ultimately, I think we all want the same thing, a system that's fair, that's humane, and that works for everyone.
Well said. So, to our listener, as you head into that meeting, remember to keep an open mind, be respectful, and don't be afraid to ask questions.
And most importantly, keep learning. This is just the beginning of the conversation. There's so much more to explore, so much more to understand.
That's right. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and, maybe even a little thought-provoking.
It's been a pleasure diving into this with you.
And to our listener, keep those critical thinking caps on. There's always more to learn.